Thank you very much, first of all, for the invite. You can hear me loud and clear?
We can.
And I think that's the first tip I'm going to give you, largely because it's probably the most important thing, and sometimes we don't think of it very much. When you go into a radio studio, all the hard work is done for you. Usually the good microphone is there, the headphones are there, you can hear everything that's going on. In a Zoom situation these days, as many of you will be taking interviews and whatever, it's crucial that you hear, first of all, the questions that you're going to be asked, but also to be able to get the best out of what you're actually saying. And we don't always realize that when we're in the Zoom room, because we're just talking to the screen or whatever. We're just taking it for granted. We've got a good sound. So I'm very conscious always of sound. I'm an audiophile. That's the way I was and was brought up and whatever. So it's very important. Obviously, Zoom is perfectly important too, to have the good look and see how you look. That's always important. But I have to be honest, I was not necessarily suited for radio, except that I had the perfect face for radio. So that's kind of the point I'm making. Just think of the parameters. Radio tips. I have had a bit of experience in radio, a very long experience in radio. And it's often, at least at the start, it used to be in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So I feel a little bit like that now. A lot of you folks have done a lot of the stuff that I've done in different ways. So I've only got the experience for it because I suppose people paid me to be on the radio. And that gives us a certain credence, apparently. Took me a while to figure out what radio was about. And the really important thing to understand if you're a radio broadcaster is not apparent. You've got two ears and you've got one mouth. And a lot of people make the mistake that it's about the mouth. It's actually about the ears. And the secret for me in a good interviewing situation was always the listening. So if I can just give you that tip, it's exactly the same if you become an interviewee. You really have to listen, first of all, to what the question is, and then thereafter as to what you're saying yourself. It's a bit like, and very much like, giving a speech. You're giving a speech. You think you know all the bits and pieces, but are you hearing your own projection? Are you hearing your own tonality? Are you hearing the words and having the sense of what you're doing? So you always have to put yourself into that mindset. But let's reverse the whole process again. What I found over the years was surprising to me. People used to come up to me and say, do you know, it must be impossible to get people on the radio. You know, you can't do this subject, you can't do this, you can't do the other. And I realized that it was very simple to get people onto the radio. You just had to ask them. They generally never refused. And I'm sure if you get that opportunity within the Toastmaster situation, take it with both hands, because it saves you doing a lot of the groundwork that you're trying to do in social media and word of mouth. It's just a bigger word of mouth. With bigger ears, more ears listening. So you'll understand the sense of that. But in the reverse of all of that, I think the mistake can easily be made when you're on the outside thinking, how am I ever going to get onto a radio program? Well, I can tell you now, they don't come driving past in the street to grab you. You got to go out looking. And surprise, and this is a surprise to many people, or perhaps it was just my experience. The radio broadcaster, if it's a particular type of radio, and if it's a smaller radio station, perhaps not Radio 2 or whatever, they are looking for you. They have to be. That's their role and responsibility. So if you realize that and you join the dots, knock on the door. That's the first tip I can say. Don't be fearful in any way about they're going to say no. And that is the worst, that they can say no. And more often than not, they are looking for people like you. Now, it depends on what type of radio station area you have and whether it's a community service or whether it's a commercial service. Less so the commercial service, they won't have much space for you. So when you do get the opportunity, it's going to have to be short, sharp, and like a table topics evening. Or perhaps it's a community station where you're going to get a little bit longer, but they are looking for people out there. Now, they could be just looking for you for the one-off hit. Listen, something's coming up. Little shiny sticker in your hand saying, we're doing this next week. We're going to have a special guest. So that might be one attraction. They may well be a community station. They're looking for people just because they need them. But what you can do once you've established that you are this Toastmaster group, that you can then perhaps feed into some of the other programming that they have or require. Some stations, for example, and James will know this, will want reviewers for different events. So you can put yourself forward. I think, James, you do that, don't you, as a regular reviewer. And suddenly you're a reviewer on the radio station, reviewing films, reviewing books, reviewing anything, reviewing The Taste of Salt. But you're now an expert, but you're also a Toastmaster. So you're building the brand of the Toastmaster in giving your expertise. And invariably, they're looking for people. I know this from my own experience because I was a broadcaster on a community style station. It was a commercial station, and my job was to outreach to the folks out there. And there was no Toastmasters certainly in the area that I was in. Eventually, when I moved to Newry and Dundalk, there were Toastmaster clubs there. But I had a couple of features, and one of them was a film review. And had there been a Toastmasters organization, perhaps I'd be reaching out to them. I did have a lady who did the film reviews for me in a particular station. Mind you, she managed to, in the second review, fall out with the company, the only movie company or cinema company that we had in the area, and she decided to tell them that the Charlie Chaplin movie they were showing was brilliant, except there were only 4 or 5 people in the audience. That's not what the cinema people wanted to hear, but it was the whole idea and principle of it, because you have to realize that once you get that opportunity, you're probably, because of your skills, you're going to shine on that radio station when you do that. You're going to stand out from the folks who don't do this for a living. And I'm describing Toastmasters who do talking for a living, basically, except they don't get a living for it. So those are some of the things I would say to you. And thereafter, tell me when to stop now, because I've only got 3 more hours of things to say. So whenever you feel like putting up the green and the amber and the red lights, you go right ahead. The idea is when you're asked to come in. Let's take the scenario when you're asked to come in, or you've gone and approached the person. They should be able to give you some parameters that you can then work to. Just like the red and the green and whatever light, they'll tell you what length of time they're likely to want you for. They're going to tell you roughly, if you haven't given them the reason for talking, they'll give you the reason for talking. And go in with the belief that unless you're a politician of the highest order or other, that they're going to give you a relatively easy time. Unless it's a shock jock, it's very unlikely that you get too many of them. We have one here in Northern Ireland. You're welcome to take him with you, because we don't particularly like his whole style, but that's another story. So when you go in there, you have to get yourself the idea of taking the 3 deep breaths before you go anywhere, centering yourself and saying, this is going to be fun, because invariably it will be. And you could ask for what the questions might be beforehand. Now, if you'd asked me, I'd said, do you know, I have no idea until we switched on that microphone. Now, that was largely true, but that was based on having the experience to figure out what I was going to ask, because there are only a certain amount of styles of questions they're going to ask you. They're not going to ask you for your bank account or PIN number. They're going to ask you questions about the subject. They're going to ask you questions that will elicit the answers that will give understanding to their listeners, and that should be making it as simple as possible. That doesn't mean that you write down 3 lines of what you think should be said and leave it at that. There's the best opportunity you will ever get to extemporize. But when you extemporize, you've already thought of what you're going to say. They don't know that. They'll think, my goodness, this man is thinking off the top of his head. Isn't he so articulate? Isn't she the cleverest person I've ever thought? And all they've done is thought about what they were going to say. And it can be about the organization. It can be about your event. It can be about something outside of that. And what you can really do, and this is where the benefit of going into the situation is realizing that they may have some certain amount of questions, but you're always invariably going to have more knowledge about the subject of Toastmasters. You're always going to have that advantage. So you can direct the conversation around once the first question is answered, as it were, and providing they're listening, they won't ask you a written down question that has already been answered, but there's no guarantee. Some radio presenters do not listen. This one used to listen, still listens. So that's important. So you're doing the job of the other person, but you've got the opportunity to expand. And I learned that in a circumstance of where I was going for a job and I got some experience with a company that trained you how to work, to interview. And it was very useful. And I just simply give it to you now. They ask you one area of experience and what's your experience. So if you left it at that block of experience, it was like a CV. Well, that wasn't good enough, because what you really should be doing is picking out examples of that to show what you could actually do and how you problem solved, for example. And as soon as I got that, I said, do you know, I could nearly pass any interview. I'm not sure if I'm passing this interview. The whole idea is that you have an understanding of where you want to take the conversation. You have that ability. And certainly, hopefully, with the Toastmaster skill, with table topics, you will have developed that skill to think beforehand or to bring the conversation around to where you want it. And it doesn't mean that you speak for 10 minutes like I'm doing. You can do it in 1 minute or 2 minutes, or allow for expansion. What other tips can I give you? Just keep knocking on the door. Just keep knocking and knocking and knocking. It's like any journalistic scenario. If you write enough letters, they'll send one back and say, we have to let him go. It's the Shawshank Redemption phenomenon, where Andy, whatever his name is, kept writing and writing and writing to the board for library books and library books. And 10 years later, they sent him as many as he wanted. And then he kept writing, and he got more and he got more and he got more. So keep knocking at those doors. Never be afraid to ask the question, can we have a little notice, or can I help you? That's the extension of it too. I'm a Toastmaster. I'd like to be your reviewer. I'm a Toastmaster. I'd like to answer that question. When you're doing a special day, can we come in as a Toastmaster and be part of that circle that perhaps you have, weekly review or whatever it might be. I'll keep quiet now and see if I can listen for a while.